Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I know it has been a while since my last upload, but I am back and today I am bringing you a video that I have been stewing on for several months now. I've been working on this one kind of slowly, taking my time on it, kind of getting it ready, going through different ideations of it, but I'm here today to make this video, which is me creating every Overwatch League team's all-star roster. Now technically I've already created them, but I'm going to walk you through my thought process for each of the rosters as we go throughout this video, making up every single team's all-star roster using the best players from each of those teams' rosters. Now, there are some rules that I have established and set up in order to avoid kind of just going the easy route of constantly just making rosters with just taking the best roster they've ever had and saying that's the best one. So let's go through some of the rules that I have established just so we can see where we are coming from for this one. So the first one is that each team will have 7 players total. So that is going to be 3 DPS players, 2 tanks, and 2 supports. I decided on 7 mainly because that is the minimum roster requirement that the Overwatch League has had for the past, I think, 2 seasons. But also gives you that leeway to kind of have an additional DPS player when you usually kind of don't always have the same level of flexibility there. So it's an attempt to try to make the roster seem pretty good, like it has some flexibility. Doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be that way, but that is one of the the rules that I have there, is that there's 3 DPS players, 2 tanks, and 2 supports, just for a little bit of added freedom, just because of the way that DPS is as a role, and how flexible it is, and how many teams have pretty big rotations for DPS. Second thing is that every team will have at least 1 player from each season, with room for exceptions when needed. This essentially means that every single team will have at least 1 player that joined the roster in each of the years that that season existed. So if it's a team from 2018, I'll have 1 player from the 2018 season that joined in 2018, 1 that joined in 2019, 1 that joined in 2020, 1 that joined in 2021. And if it's a team from 2019, then it'll be a 2019 player, a 2020 player, and a 2021 player. Like I said, there are some room for exceptions, and I will explain them as we go along, and there'll be another one here in just a little bit on this kind of first rules thing. Next rule is that players will only be judged based on their performance with the team they are being considered for. So any player that has played on multiple teams, a player like Happy or Striker or Dante, just to name a few, Fate, those are players who will only be judged for the team that I am potentially putting them on the list for. So Fate could be on the list for the Shanghai Dragons, for example, but I would only consider what he did in 2021. I wouldn't look at all what he did in 2019 or 2018 or 2020. And that would be the case for any player who I was considering putting on this list. Players may appear on more than one team's list, so a player who was really, really good for multiple teams could appear on both of those teams' lists. I'm not going to disqualify them because they were really good for one team and then they were really good for another team later on. They can be potentially on 2 lists, 3 lists, 4 lists if they played on that many teams. Not going to disqualify them for that. Final rule, which is kind of the main one that I wanted to touch on here, is that players may be disqualified for consideration at my discretion for a number of different things that I have determined. It could be a lack of playtime, could be that they join a team and didn't actually play for that team really, so it doesn't make sense to put them on there. So it could be a team where they had 1 player join the team in a season and then they never played, so they can't go on the list, or something that happens out of game. Certain players who have kind of blacklisted in a sense from this channel are not considered for this list. So with those rules in place, let's go on and let's take a look at the first of the teams. We'll be going in alphabetical order, so we're going to start with the Atlanta Reign. This team joined the Overwatch League in 2019, so there will be 3 players for that spot. So a 2019 player, a 2020 player, and a 2021 player. For 2019, I chose Masa. Masa, on the team for a very long time, of course, was the starting main support for 2019 and 2020 and 2021. Incredibly consistent players, Lucio play especially, very, very good. Had a bit of a down year in 2020, but was really good in 2019, had a really good year again in 2021, so definitely a player that I was really impressed by, and I think 100% is a standout player from this Reign roster. Definitely deserving of this first spot. From 2020, I am picking Hawk. Once again, really good player, joined in 2020, and has been the starting off tank for the team ever since. Has been incredibly consistent, can play all of the heroes at a really high level, synergizes really well with the team, so player who I have been very impressed by. I thought he got better from 2020 to 2021, and for me, definitely the best off tank this team has had. And for 2021, no surprise, I picked Pelican. You win Rookie of the Year, you're probably going to be on this list for your team. He was incredible for his team, and so he gets this spot. Don't think I need to explain much more than that. Just his performance, very, very good. One of the best tracers we saw, one of the best players in general. So Pelican rounding out the kind of requirements for each player and each season. So let's continue with the DPS. Let's finish off those. I picked Kai. Definitely could be a bit of a controversial pick when you have a player like Baby Bay or Edison, who played on this roster for significantly longer. But I don't think either of those two players ever had the same level of impact on this team that Kai did. Obviously, the Atlanta Reign were at their best in 2021. They made the grand finals. And so much of that was on the backs of Pelican and Kai and their incredible DPS play. So I couldn't not have Kai on this list. To me, he is one of the best DPS players we've ever seen play in the Overwatch League, and he is easily one of the best that the Atlanta Reign have had. The third one, a little bit tough. I was pretty torn between Baby Bay and Edison. A little bit Erster, but he kind of came and went pretty quickly, so I kind of limited him pretty quickly. So it was really between Edison and Baby Bay, but I ultimately went with Edison just because I think we saw a little bit more from him. He was on the team for 2 whole seasons, was someone who was asked to kind of play quite a bit of things. He was pretty flexible. He played flex DPS sometimes, put some hit scan DPS at times, so I felt like he was a good choice for this spot. I think he's just a really good player, and I think that he was the kind of right player that fit this spot the best. Ironic that the team so far has been entirely the roster they had last season, but this kind of happens when you are the best team that you put together and you have built around some of the same players over time and really just kind of developed your roster in a good way. For the main tank, I chose Gator for the same reasons why I have players like Hawk on here and Masa on here. He's been on the team for a long time. He's been the best main tank they've had. It was really just him and Pokepo, and Gator was better than Pokepo, was more consistent than Pokepo, took the starting job from Pokepo, and to me, no-brainer for him to be the number 1 main tank for this Reign team. Weren't many options, so but Gator is a no-brainer, has been the best main tank for this team. Finally, for the flex support role, it was really between Iris and Dogman, but I went with Iris. Dogman was obviously good for this team in 2019 and 2020. Iris didn't play nearly as many matches for this team as what we saw from Dogman. But the level of play we saw from Iris was, in my opinion, significantly higher than we ever saw from Dogman. Different hero pools, obviously. Iris a really good BAP, not as great on Ana and Zen. Dogman played a lot more than Ana and Zen, but Iris showed so many flashes of brilliance that we never really saw from Dogman that I just felt like I had to give it to Iris. So there you go. There's my 7-player roster from the Atlanta Reign, which I would say is their kind of all-star best roster. Happens to be the roster that made the grand finals this past season, but I can guarantee you that will not be happening much for any other teams, if any at all. Next, we have the Boston Uprising, the next team alphabetically. Starting in 2018, this team, of course, one of the inaugural season teams. I'm giving it to Striker, best player I think this Boston Uprising team has ever had still to this day. His performances in 2018 were outstanding. They were, 10-0 in Stage 3 of 2018, primarily because of Striker. So, give a lot of credit where credit is due for Striker being a legendary player. Happy to see him return to the Boston Uprising in a way for the 2021 season, or 2022 season. It'd be a little odd to see him back there, but definitely a player who outperformed everybody in the league for the most part in 2018 on that DPS role. One of the top MVP candidates, but my first pick for the Uprising. For the 2019 pick, I chose Fusions. I feel like this is another no-brainer. For 2019 and 2020, he really was the identity for this Uprising team. Came in basically the start of the season at 2019, immediately led them to a stage playoff appearance in Stage 1 of 2019. They fell off quite a lot after that, but I always found Fusions to be one of the best players on the team, one one of the most consistent players on the team. I thought his performances were really, really good. And he was just such a great personality and a great leader, a great shot caller, a very busy and active shot caller. So not just his play, but also his leadership and what he brought to the team environment, for me, gives him a spot on this list. From 2020, I chose Punk. Main reason why I chose Punk is just because I think Punk has looked really, really strong. He's the foundational piece that they have kind of built some of this roster around going forward. I think that Punk has been very good. Obviously, the fact that he was able to play over Gaebelshi when that roster would have otherwise been an entirely Korean roster, they would have calmed entirely in Korean, they wouldn't have to call in English at all, shows you just how strong of a player Punk is. And I just think he's been good his entire time with the Uprising, so I put him here. And for the 2021 player, this one's maybe a little interesting to people. I chose Faith. I've always been very critical of the Boston Uprising main supports. I was not a firm believer in Kelix for his first 2 years with the team. I was not a believer in Swimmer or Halo in 2020, and Faith to me has been the best main support they've had. 2021, they didn't add a ton of players that I felt had a ton of impact, but Faith was one of them. He is a piece they are choosing to build around for the future, and I think that Faith definitely deserves a spot on this roster based on what we've seen from him and what he's brought to the Uprising that we haven't seen from a lot of other players. All right, next for the DPS lineup, I have Valentine. The DPS for the Boston Uprising historically have not been all that great. They've been a pretty inconsistent and weak team, and really when they were very good, it was because they had Striker, who could just kind of carry, and they had Gomsto and Note, who were both very good players for the team. It was really kind of a three-man show for that team in 2018. I chose to go with Fusions and Punk instead, just to kind of fit the requirements that I had. But Valentine was very good this past season. He's not good on every hero, but when he plays his comforts, he looks really good. So I wanted to give him credit for where that performance came from, and I think that he was one of the top players for the Uprising this past season. So figured I'd put him on this list. Third DPS for me was really difficult, and I probably picked one that a lot of people are going to disagree with. For me, I looked at who they've had in the past. They've had Blase, of course. They've had Color Hex. They've had Mistakes. I mean, they've had a ton of players who kind of come and go. But to me, the Boston Uprising will never be... You can't talk about the Boston Uprising without talking about the success they had in 2018. You cannot talk about how strong that team was and not talk about the impressiveness that was truly Mistakes coming into that roster. He was already on the team, but didn't really play that much. And they went 10-0 in Stage 3 with players who really didn't play together much. Because Mistakes played very well, in my opinion. I think you have to highlight what he did for this 2018 Uprising roster, what he brought to the team. He was not the best player this team has ever had. I definitely think a lot of people would argue Color Hex should be here more. Obviously, he was there for 3 seasons. I was never the most impressed with Color Hex. I always thought he was just kind of an average player. He had some flashy moments, but I want to give credit to the 2018 Uprising for their work and what they did, becoming one of the best teams in that season, and having that really strong stage, which was their best stage ever. And I think Mistakes was a big part of that. So, a player who definitely has been largely forgotten by Overwatch League fans and Mistakes, I think, is somebody who deserves some credit for what this team did back in 2018. Final spot is the flex support, which they've had pretty good flex supports in Boston. Neko was good in 2018, then you had Aim God in 2019, and then you had Myeonbong, who came in 2020 and 2021, and I think Myeonbong he was the best part of this team in 2020 when they were the worst they've ever been, and he was one of the best parts in 2021 when they were one of the best performance to everything from Boston, so definitely Myeonbong has to be on this list. So there he is. He is the player that I round out this Boston Uprising roster with, the 7-man roster. There it is. Moving on to the Chengdu Hunters. This is a fun one. Player that has a team that has had a lot of the same players for the entirety of their existence. So picking a player from 2019 was not too difficult. Picking some other ones where you do run into some of the more difficult picks. But to start from 2019, I of course went with Jinmu. He's been one of the best players on this team. He's been consistent. His DPS performance has been really, really good. I've always found Jinmu to be a very exciting and exhilarating player. Fan favorite, you can't talk about the Chengdu Hunters without talking about Jinmu, so of course he is on this list. He is the 2019 representative, one of many, I can tell you that right now. For 2020, I chose Leave. I don't think that's a big surprise. Leave is a player who we have seen a ton of really great performances out of, including, 2021 MVP. So felt very natural for Leave to be the player in this spot. I'm a big fan of Leaves. I think he improved greatly from 2020 to 2021. One of the best players we've seen in the Overwatch League, so definitely one of the top players the Chengdu Hunters have had. And for 2021, I went with Monk. I've been a huge fan of Monk. I thought that he was one of the most consistent players on this Chengdu Hunters roster last season. I really liked his play. I was kind of skeptical of him after they had Molly in 2020, who I really, really liked. I thought it was a big risk moving on from Molly and having a player like Monk and player far away as well, who didn't get as much play time as Monk. But I really liked Monk. I thought Monk was very good. So credit where credit is due. Monk impressed me a lot, so put him on this list. Third DPS player on this list, I chose Bacon Jack. Played for 2019 and 2020 on this Hunters roster. Was never the most played player. He played a lot more in 2019 than he did in 2020. Primarily alongside Jinmu. Yang Zhelong played as well at times, but really kind of Bacon Jack, to me, is really kind of the quintessential DPS player, kind of journeyman for this team, who was there for a lot of it. He was there for their best times and their worst times. And I think that what he did for the team, we saw a lot more of him than we saw of Jimmy. So I just felt like Bacon Jack was the best option here to round out that DPS trio. For the tanks, have put Among on this list. Yeah, he may have been benched for the majority of 2021 in favor of Gaga, but this team in 2019 and 2020 was dictated by Among. He decided how this team played, and I would argue that they still play the way they play because of Among, because they are so used to that style that they had to have Gaga come in to be someone who they think is a potentially better version of Among. And obviously they've been able to run far different stuff with Gaga in, because Gaga has more flexibility. But you can't talk about the Chengdu Hunters, not talk about Among. Not only just his performances, but also just kind of his impact on the team's community and on the Overwatch League community at large. Among has to be on this list. Off tank, I went with Elsa over Late Young. Elsa played more, played 2.5 seasons. Late Young was on the team for technically longer than Elsa, but didn't play as much over Elsa. Really was an Elsa-Among duo for the majority of the Hunters' lifespan, so have to give credit to Elsa for what he was able to do for this team. And finally, I have, of course, Yveltal. I'm sorry, Yveltal, for using your 2019 picture, because we all know Yveltal does not look like this anymore, but hey, that's just the way I wanted to do this. But Yveltal was a very good player, and still is a very good player for this Hunters roster. He's had his ups and downs, but I think he's overall been a very good player. Still one of the best Mercs we've ever seen in the Overwatch League, so love watching Yveltal play, so definitely 100% think he deserves to be at this spot here. So there we go. There is your Chengdu Hunters best roster, which is essentially just players they've had for a really long time. It's just the way the Hunters have been. They've been a very consistent team. They haven't changed the roster up very much, so what? 3 of these players are gone. Just Bacon Jack, Among, and Elsa. The other 4 are still there, so impressive team. Moving on to the Dallas Fuel. Oh boy, is this a fun one. A team that went from pretty much one of the worst in the league to one of the best in the league over 4 years. Lots of parity in terms of who they had. So 2018 was the toughest player for me to pick, because I really just felt the Fuel in 2018 were so unmemorable. And there were some players that I chose not to choose for certain reasons, whether just because I didn't think they were very good or they didn't play enough, or other factors. So I went with an interesting one for 2018. I went with Seagull. I'm sure there'll be people out there who disagree with me for putting Seagull here. But from what I remember of the 2018 Dallas Fuel, Seagull is one of the players that impressed me the most. He filled a lot of different roles. He played Diva at times, but he started the season playing DPS before AKM joined the team. I just felt like Seagull was pretty good for this team. I thought he was one of the few players that actually looked consistent for the Dallas Fuel. And cultural, obviously, huge impact on the Overwatch landscape. One of the most popular players we've ever had. He his days, in Apex were really, really big. So I want to give him a shout out because I think that you have to recognize what he did for the Dallas Fuel as a team and his kind of contributions to this team in a lot of different ways. So he's my 2018 choice. 2019, I chose Note. Dallas Fuel were not very good in 2019 either. They're definitely better than they were. But Note, to me, was the best player from that team. He was pretty consistent. The reason why he was on the team as long as he was, he was on the team for 2019 and 2020. He was good. Solid player. So, figured I'd give him a spot here based on what we saw from him. For 2020, I am going with Doha. Doha's been very good for this team. One of the only player to survive the roster purge that happened after 2020. Still one of the best players, one of the most elite DPS players we've seen, alongside some other very good names. Players like Sparkle and Fearless and, Hanbin, which have made this Dallas Fuel roster now really well known. Doha has been among the best over the past 2 seasons, especially at Sombra, so definitely felt like he deserved a spot here. And then we have Fearless as the 2021 pick. I mean, he was one of the MVP candidates, one of the leading MVP candidates. I think Fearless is arguably the best main tank in the league. I think the way he dictated this team's playstyle was really important. They played around him, and he was super successful for the majority of the season. Definitely wanted to have Hanbin on this list, but I went with Note because of his time on the team in 2019 and 2020. Obviously, I think you could definitely put Hanbin on this list, and you would be right. But I like this group here as kind of the 4 representing the 4 seasons that they played. But finishing up with the last 3 players, of course, at DPS you have to put Sparkle in. He was incredible this past season, one of the best seasons from a player ever in the Overwatch League. Very, very good performances out of Sparkle. Roll Star, fan favorite player, so huge shout out to Sparkle. I have Jexa, main support. Was very, very good for this team. They haven't had a ton of really great main supports. I mean, they had Custa in Season 1, and they traded him away, and then they just kind of had a rotating door in Season 1 of just questionable main support play. Or I should say Season 1, 2, and 3 of questionable main support play. They had Paintbrush at a time. They had Closer. I mean, they just had a whole rotating door. But Jexa was most consistent. He may not be with the team anymore, but he was pretty good for them in 2021. And for the flex support, of course, I went with Fielder. Fielder's great. I'm a big Fielder fan. I think Fielder's one of the best players we've seen in the flex support role over the past couple of years. So, had to give him a spot here in this roster. So there you go. That's your Dallas Fuel roster. This is their all-star roster. Definitely some players that some people would not put on this lineup, but here they are. Moving on to the Florida Mayhem. From 2018, I have Saya Player. We didn't see a ton of him in the Overwatch League. To be completely honest with you, he dealt with a lot of different issues in terms of like mental health and injuries from what I remember. It may just mostly been injuries. I don't remember exactly. But when he did play, he was an incredible hit scan player, one of the best in the league, one of the most fun to watch. So definitely deserves a spot on this list. For 2019, I chose Fate. I think Fate is one of the best main tanks I've ever seen in the Overwatch League, and he's still playing at a very high level. I think he was the glue that kept this Mayhem roster together in 2019 and 2020. I think his role in the team was undervalued, and so definitely a huge credit to Fate for making the Mayhem become, in my opinion, one of the most legit teams for, the 2020 season and even the end of 2019. He really kind of helped turn this team around, so huge credit there. For 2020, of course, I had to go with Yaki. I mean, Yaki was incredible for this team. He was among the best. He did super, super, super well for this team. He was one of the best players that they had, and a lot of credit to him for being, an MVP candidate essentially for a lot of his time there. BKB, rounding out the DPS lineup, 2021 player we'll get to in a second. I just wanted to kind of put them later on in this list. But BKB, a very good player. Really, really talented player, of course. Among the Mayhem legends in a lot of ways. So I had to put BQB here in this list because I think BQB's had a really great season, or seasons with the Florida Mayhem. Went from being kind of average in 2019 to being a pretty solid hit scan option in 2020 and 2021. So love having BQB on this list. Definitely deserves a spot here. I have Gargoyle here as the off-tank option. He was really the only option. Their other off-tanks are never really all that great. I'm not the biggest fan of Gargoyle. I think Gargoyle is a product of being with a very solid supporting cast. Players like Fate and Gangnam Jin, who really helped him out. But even in 2019, when he was kind of just getting into the league and just joining this team, he impressed, and he did some really good, solid things on his Roadhog. And then we saw him, come into 2020, play a lot of Sigma and play a lot of Diva and look a lot better. So I do think Gargoyle definitely is deserving of a spot on this roster. He's the best off-tank they've had by far, and his performances on this team cannot be understated. My 2021 pick is Slime. Slime, they only added 3 players in 2021. It was Slime, OG, and Checkmate, and Slime was far and away the best of those 3. I would argue the best main support this team has ever had is Slime. Didn't have his best season with the Mayhem, but he was still very good, and I think that you cannot look at this Mayhem roster and talk about the success of this Mayhem roster when they did find success in 2021, as little as it was, without highlighting Slime and what he was able to do. And finally, for flex support, of course, it's Gangnam Jin. Gangnam Jin was incredible during his time with the Mayhem. Still one of the best flex supports in the league, if I had to give you my honest opinion. So definitely being on this list. So here we go. Mayhem, full Korean roster for them. But this is definitely the 7 that I would say were the best Mayhem roster that you could put together. Next, we have the Guangzhou Charge. Starting off with 2019. I don't know why I said that so weirdly. Shu. Shu was one of the best players in the Guangzhou Charge. I think we realized over time how important he was and how great he was for this team. An irreplaceable player in a lot of ways. One of the most elite flex supports in the game. Love watching Shu play. He's an incredibly exciting player to watch. And he was the backbone for the Guangzhou Charge's 2019 successes, and especially their success in 2020. Speaking of 2020, you cannot talk about the Guangzhou Charge and not talk about Krong, who was a Rookie of the Year candidate, an MVP candidate in 2020. One of the best off-tanks in 2020. His Sigma especially is incredible, and definitely one of my favorite players to watch. Loved watching him find success in the Overwatch League. Definitely the top flex tank they have had in their time in the Overwatch League, so Krong, 100% confident in him here in the off-tank spot. And for 2021, not a great season for them, but there was one player who did stand out, and who I think even if I just chose players based on how they looked, he would still make this list. That is Choi Se-won. Choi Se-won was incredible for the Guangzhou Charge, especially early in the season, when they still looked like they had some fire left in them. His Tracer, outstanding. Performed very well against some teams who were pretty good. Held his own in a lot of cases. I'm excited to see him going forward when I think this roster will be more focused on building around him and playing around him. I think Choi Se-won will be one of the best players we see. So definitely excited to see Choi Se-won going forward. And I think he's one of the best DPS players we've seen on the Guangzhou Charge. But you can't talk about the Guangzhou Charge without talking about, of course, Happy and Eileen, the other 2 outstanding DPS players that they have had on this team throughout their history. Happy, of course, played on this team for 2019 and 2020 before moving on to the Houston Outlaws. Eileen, still on this team, still one of the best players on this team. Absolutely incredible performance in the 2020 Summer Showdown. Really the thing that turned the Summer Showdown around for the Guangzhou Charge, led to their victory there. And Happy, every time he hits the server, he pops off. He's an incredible hit scan talent. One of my favorite players to watch play, so you can't talk about the Guangzhou Charge and not talk about these 2. Main tank was pretty easy. They've only really had one main tank in Guangzhou Charge's history, and that is Rio. Very consistent player. May not be the best, may not be the highest performing, super flashy main tank player, but he's consistent and he's good, and that's really all you can ask for out of a main tank. So definitely Rio is my main tank pick. And for main support, I went with Chara. We saw Neptuno on this team. We saw Mondu on this team. But I think Chara was the best main support they had. He got benched several times, obviously. He got benched for Neptuno. He didn't play all the time in 2019. But he was the best main support they had. He played very, very well. This team played better in 2020 when Chara was in. I think he was a very smart player. He's obviously a coach now, so he's an intelligent player who understands the game very well if he is a coach. So Chara, to me, definitely the top main support they've had. He rounds out this 7-man roster for the Guangzhou Charge. Moving on to the other Zhou team, we have the Hangzhou Spark. First one from 2018 or 2019. This is not a surprise to anybody. Of course, it's Gushui. Gushui is the best player the Hangzhou Spark have had ever. He is incredible. He's amazing. He's handsome. I mean, what can he do? Gushui does everything. He's Winston, incredible. His Reinhardt, incredible. He's an incredible specimen. Here he is, though. 2019 pick for the Hangzhou Spark. Moving on to the 2020 pick, I chose Architect. They didn't add a lot of players in 2020. They added Mika, they added Coldest, they added Architect, and then later in the season they added QOQ after the retirement of Rhea, or the kind of stepping away of Rhea. But Architect definitely had a big impact on this team in 2020 and 2021. Was he as good as he was on the Shock? I would argue he wasn't, but I think that he has continued to look good on this Spark roster. What he brought to them in 2020 was pretty notable, and he definitely looks, I think, going forward to have a bounce-back season. But he's been good, and he was one of the most consistent players for the Spark team, so had to give him a spot here. And for 2021, no surprise, it's Shy. Such an incredible player, such a talented player. One of the leading Rookie of the Year candidates for a decent chunk of the 2021 season. Incredible hit scan talent. One of the best players in the league, I think, in just terms of raw skill and raw talent. So, Shy, 100%. One of the best players the Spark have ever had. Final DPS I'm going to put on here is Godsby. His relatively unceremonious departure from the Hangzhou Spark, though they did have a pretty large social media post about it, and they did kind of give him a lot of credit and love after he departed. But though it was a rather unceremonious end, he was still very good for this team. One of the most important players to the team. He was there from the beginning. He was there when they were at their best, and he was there when they were at their worst. But Godsby was very, very good. But, you have Shy on this roster. It becomes a little bit more difficult to find a lot of playtime when you're playing alongside someone who's really, really good and might be the best in the league in terms of raw talent. So definitely think that Shy and Godsby are two of the best DPS players, though, that the Spark have had, so both of them make this list. Off-tank was a tough one, mainly because I thought that Rhea was pretty good when he was with this team, but he was never incredible. Then they had QOQ and Sasin, who kind of played at times in 2020, who were both pretty good, but not amazing. And then they added Bernard in 2021, who I do really like Bernard, but do I think that he played well enough to be considered the best off-tank? Thought about it, and I decided that Bernard was the player I would give credit to. Maybe Rhea should be the one on this spot, because the team was at their best when Rhea played. But I just think in terms of what we actually saw from just raw talent and what we saw just from the way they played, yes, the Spark were not as good with Bernard playing, but I don't think that was on Bernard. I think Bernard was very, very, very good. I think he's one of the best players that this team has ever had. And I'm a huge Bernard fan, so I definitely think Bernard deserves some credit for what he's done for this team. And the fact that he's still on this team, despite the fact they still have Liga on this team, on the bench, speaks volumes to me about the type of player Bernard is. Moving on to the supports, obviously IDK in this spot, one of the top main supports we've seen over the past several years. Was a very good player for this team for 3 seasons. Really the only main support they ever ran. They ran Meek every so often, but IDK really was their number one, especially in 2021 and 2019, so had to give him some love. And for the flex support, I went with Bebe. We didn't really see a ton out of Coldest during his time, and they competed a bit in 2020. They ultimately decided to keep Coldest, move on to some other flex supports, though. But I think Bebe was pretty good. The team was at their best when Bebe played for the team. And I think that we have seen other flashes from Bebe that show he is a very good player. But even just based on his time purely in the Hangzhou Spark, they're more successful with Bebe than anybody else. So I give him the edge over Coldest. Moving on to the Houston Outlaws from 2018, we have to, of course, include Jake. Has been on this team for a very long time with the, of course, season he took off to cast. But what a great player Jake is. He not only is like the player that is synonymous with the Houston Outlaws brand, but he also was a very good player for the Houston Outlaws. And you have to, you can't talk about the Houston Outlaws and not talk about Jake. So Jake 100% deserves this spot on this roster. 2019, the Houston Outlaws only signed one new player. But boy, was he good, because it was Dante. Dante joined this roster in 2019, coming over from the Shock. And he was the best player on this team pretty much immediately. He is now kind of synonymous with the Houston Outlaws in much the same way Jake was, and still is. Dante is the Houston Outlaws now. I think Dante's a really good player. I like watching Dante play. I think Dante has brought a ton of fire to the Western audience with his Tracer and Sombra play. So Dante 100% deserving a spot on this roster. 2020 was tough. I was torn, but I wanted to put Mecha on this list, but spoiler alert, Piggy exists. So I was between, at that point then, really just kind of thinking about either a DPS player like Hydration, or going with the support line of Jexe and or Repel. Ultimately, I decided to go with Jexe. The Outlaws are a team that I think have never really impressed me with their main support play, but I did think Jexe was actually pretty good when he was with the Outlaws. I think he was actually a pretty solid standout main support player with the Outlaws. He was among the top-level main supports in that season, and just kind of underrated because the Outlaws were not very good in 2020. But I thought Jexe performed pretty well, so figured I'd give him a shout-out for his 2020 performance with the Outlaws. A lot of forgettable moments from that stint, but I think he was still overall the best main support they've had. And I already told you 2021, it's Piggy, one of the best flex tank we've seen in the league. One of the pieces they've chosen to build around going forward. One of the most impressive players in my opinion, so definitely an easy shoe-in for that tank spot and that 2021 spot. Another 2021 player I wanted to give a spot on this list was Happy. Looked very, very good when he was with the Outlaws this past season. One of the most important players, especially in their early season success. Obviously, the game against San Francisco Shock where he popped off. You cannot talk about the 2021 Outlaws and not talk about Happy and their overall success. Obviously, 2020 was their best season. And I think Happy was a major factor in that. So definitely Happy, one of the all-stars, Houston Outlaws. Main tank, I went with Jonggu. Main tank was a very rough position for the Outlaws for 3 seasons, but I was happy with the play we saw from Jonggu in 2021, especially, of course, that game against the Shock that everybody remembers. I think Dreamer also had good performances, but to me, Jonggu just edged him out just a little bit more. He was a bit of a better, more consistent player, and I think his flashes were a little bit higher than we saw from Dreamer, so for me, I had to put Jonggu here. And closing it out with the flex support, they've had some pretty good, consistent flex support players. Obviously, Raucus was the big one that they had for the first 2.5 years of this team's existence. They had Repel as well, and then this past season they had Crimzo. But I have to give it to Raucus, man. I know Raucus was a heavily criticized player, a highly criticized player. A lot of people did not like Raucus. A lot of people thought Raucus was one of the weakest players on this Outlaws roster consistently. I remember when he made Team USA, and people were very critical of them going with Raucus over a player like Dogman. But I think Raucus was such an important part to this team in 2018 and in 2019 and for what he played in 2020. He was splitting time with Repel, and I think for a pretty good chunk of that was because Raucus was still a very good player. He still had a lot to offer. Obviously made the switch over to Valorant, where he was still a pretty high-level and strong player, but Raucus, to me, definitely is the flex support when I think of the Houston Outlaws. He is the player that I think of. He is the player that stands out to me the most. So, have to give him the spot here as the 7th player on this Outlaws All-Star team. So let's move on from the Houston Outlaws to the London Spitfire. Another interesting team, of course, with the 2018 Grand Finals to being one of the more weak teams in 2021, but definitely some interesting players they've had throughout their time. Starting with 2018, of course, you have to give it to Prophet. He is one of the best players Overwatch League has ever seen, and I would argue still to this day the best player the London Spitfire have ever had. They didn't make a lot of roster changes following the 2018 season. They added guard, and then they added Krillin, and they added Quatermain later in the season. I ultimately just decided to go with Krillin because we did see him play in 2020 as well. And to fulfill the requirements, I figured I would have to go with Krillin because he is a player who did play quite a bit in 2020. And he was pretty good. Obviously, he's back in the Overwatch League, so he's a decent player overall. So, not a lot to say about Krillin. I think that flex support was never really the London Spitfire's strength. But Ocean was pretty good. And I think it was arguably the best they've had, but I don't think Krillin was so far behind him that him being on this list is a ridiculous thing to do. From 2020, I, of course, am going with Glister. Glister was the best player in this 2020 London Spitfire roster, far and away, in my opinion. He was the best player they had. He had great performances, one of the best DPS players from that season. One of the only reasons why the Spitfire were competitive really at all was because of Glister's really strong performances. And from 2021, we get the EU rebuild, and the best player, in my opinion, on that team was Sparker. Shax is definitely a close second for me. I think Shax also had some really great performances, but I ultimately went with Sparker because when Sparker came into the team immediately looked significantly better. And I think Sparker is such a strong player we've seen in his career. As short as it has been, he has been, in my opinion, one of the bright spots for the Spitfire recently, and I think he deserves a spot on this roster. But, of course, most of the rest of this roster, and by most of the rest of this roster, I mean the rest of this roster is going to be from that 2018 Grand Finals run. Gesture, Fury, and I actually put Sanguinar, though, as the only other player from the 2020 season on this list. Now, Gesture and Fury, I don't think I need to explain those two very much. They are two of the best players we have ever seen in the Overwatch League. Two legends of both of their respective roles, arguably the best, or at least top three for main tanks we've ever seen and off tanks we've ever seen. But main support was a pretty tough role for them for the 2018 and 2019 season. They had Closer and they had Nuss in 2018. They kind of switched between the two of them for a lot of the season. Then they brought in, as I mentioned before, Quatermain in 2019. They kept Nuss. Still didn't really work. I thought in 2020 Sanguinar was really, really good. I really liked Sanguinar. He was a really fun, exciting player to watch, and he was consistent, and I think that he just deserves a spot. I really like Sanguinar. I'm a huge Sanguinar fan. I think he was underrated, and I wanted to give him a shot, or a shout-out on this list and a spot. So there we go. Sanguinar rounding out the 7-man all-star team for the London Spitfire. Moving on to the LA Gladiators, we start with 2018, where I have Fissure. Yes, Fissure only played with this team for 3 stages, which was 30 games, which was quite a few, I guess, back then. And didn't play for this team in the playoffs, arguably needed him the most. But you cannot deny Fissure's impact on this team from day one on the Gladiators. He was, I believe, second in MVP voting in 2018. He was that good. He was that strong. Yeah, he didn't have the same level of performances in his later career, but it doesn't really matter. He was the best main tank the LA Gladiators have ever had. And I think they had, good performances out of Muse, and I think they've had good performances out of OG at times. But to me, Fissure is the 2018 Gladiators season. They were so good because of Fissure. You cannot talk about the Gladiators' history and not talk about the best main tank they've ever had, which was Fissure. From 2019, I wanted to give it to Decay. They didn't add a ton of players in 2019. Decay was really the only one that stood out to me. They added Roar as well, who didn't really play all that well, and they added, I think, Reaper, who didn't get any play time. So Decay, definitely the brightest spot from that 2019 roster, and he actually had a very good season in 2019 with the Gladiators. I think a lot of people expect him to be this elite ace-level player who's really good all the time, which he was really good, because, there was also the bidding war with him, but he definitely, to me, is the definitive best player they signed from the 2019 season. 2020, have to give it to Space. I love Space. I think he's one of the best players in the league. I think he's an incredible off-tank, and I think he's an incredible player. He is one of the best players we've seen come out of the U.S. and the Western region in general. And I think he is the leader of this Gladiators team now. He is the person who has put this team on his back and 100%, in my opinion, deserves this spot. 2021 player, I had to give it to Shu. He was an MVP candidate, okay? Shu's amazing. He is on the Guangzhou Charge list because he was amazing. And I would argue that his best season of his career was this past season with the LA Gladiators. So, no-brainer to me, Shu making this list. Next, DPS line, have to put Surefour on this list. His 2 seasons with the Gladiators, he was incredible. 2018 Surefour, amazing, especially. The Great Bamboozle, absolutely one of the best plays in Overwatch League history. Surefour was the fan favorite, kind of mainstay player for the Gladiators for the first 2 seasons. Of course he was going to be on this list, guys. I'm sure someone saw me put Fissure on this list. I was like, oh, where's Surefour? Here he is. Surefour's great. I agree. He is on this list. Final DPS player I have is Birdring. Yeah, maybe I could have put Kevster on this list, and I think you would argue Kevster is probably the top flex DPS that the Gladiators have ever had. But Birdring was just so good with this team for 2 seasons, 2 full seasons. I would argue he was, the best Overwatch of his career was with the Gladiators. I think of Birdring now, I don't think of him as an Atlanta Spitfire player. I think of him as a Gladiator. He, to me, will be an LA Gladiator forever. Prophet, to me, he was a Atlanta Spitfire player and then a Seoul Dynasty player. Birdring, to me, has solidified himself as an LA Gladiator. And as much as I love Kevster, I think Kevster had a great run. I think Kevster has been a great player in the Overwatch League. Birdring, to me, is my DPS third choice. And rounding out this list at main support, I have Big Goose. The Goose is loose. 3 great seasons of the Gladiators. One of the players who I think, basically created the brand and identity of the Gladiators for 3 seasons. Great player. Great guy. If I remember correctly, played every single map of his career. He played. He never sat a map, for 3 straight seasons. So you can't not put Big Goose on this list. You just can't not put him on the list. Next, we go to the other LA team, which has had a very up and down lifespan. Space is going to be my 2018 pick. Back-to-back rosters for Space, but he's very good. And he was incredible during his time with the Valiant. He was the most consistent piece for them for 2 straight seasons, in my opinion. I mean, if you want to talk about flex tanks in general, he has been their best flex tank, hands down. So, Space, no-brainer pick for me. Going to 2019, I'm putting Shax here. I think Shax was a big part of that 2019 roster's turnaround. Yeah, they didn't make the playoffs, just barely missing out, but Shax and his Sombra play was so important to this team and their success that I don't think you can talk about 2019 Valiant and even 2020 Valiant, which are also very, very good, when they, were a team that really kind of impressed everybody with how they performed when no one kind of thought they would be very good. You can't do that and not talk about Shax. Of course, KSP, now Kai, was on that Valiant roster in 2020 and was incredible then and was still incredible in 2020 with the rain. But really, it was the KSP era with the LA Valiant that he was kind of born as an Overwatch League legend and an all-star. And definitely, for what it's worth, you know me, I'm a big KSF fan. KSP did more with the LA Valiant than KSF did. So, huge credit to KSP. And as much as I would love to say that I put KSF on this list, I did not, because for 2021, I went with Milanran. Not a very good team, the LA Valiant, of course. They didn't win a single game in 2021, but Milanran was the most impressive player. I think him and Crystal were probably the best two. But I think Milanran probably is the player that I wanted to give the credit to, because I think he looked the best of the DPS players and just general players in the LA Valiant. So, shout out to Milanran. Good player. Next, I have Fate. 2018, the LA Valiant were a really good team. Fate was the main reason for that. I think he is a player that, as I mentioned, the Florida Mayhem was a glue that held this team together, held a lot of teams together. Didn't get a lot of the credit he deserved for how good he was, but he's finally starting to get it. So, shout out to my boy Fate. Big fan. Main support, I'm going with Custa. Yeah, maybe Custa I just liked because he was kind of like good personality and like very public, and maybe I'm a big Plat Chat fan. I like Custa a lot. But I think Custa was very good for this team when he played for them in 2018 and 2019. I think that the team found most of their success when Custa was in, and I just think that Custa, for someone who won the Dennis Savelko Award, is something that I think you cannot ignore, and he was a huge positive influence on the Overwatch League community, and still is to this day. So, gotta give credit to Custa. And for flex support, of course, I went with Kariv because Kariv is very, very good, and was very, very good with the LA Valiant, especially. Spent some time on the bench, spent some time playing DPS, but when he got to go back to that honor role, Kariv was very, very good. So that is my 7-player all-star roster of the LA Valiant. Such an interesting group here, just an odd bunch, but love this roster, man. Loved the LA Valiant, loved some of those players, loved some of those memories. So this is a fun one to revisit. This is one of my favorite ones to revisit. But let's move on to my team, my boys, the NYXL. There are a lot of players that are not going to be on this list. I'm telling you right now that I wish were on this list. It broke my heart making this one, just because of the lack of signings they've had in 2019 and 2020. They've barely signed anybody. So, I'll tell you right now, guys, my heart breaks with this one, because my favorite NYXL player of all time is not even on this list. But let's start with 2018. Of course, it's Jonak. He was the MVP in 2018, and he played every single map for 4 straight seasons with NYXL. Of course, he's on this team. He's the best player that NYXL have ever had. He's a legend. He is one of the GOAT candidates, in my opinion, for the Overwatch League, and just Overwatch in general. Had to be on this list. No way he would not be. 2019, this team only really brought in one new player, and that was Nene. Technically, they signed Flower as well. They signed him again after he left the team. Then he came back, so Nene was really their big signing. So he had to be on this list. But I also think Nene, for his hit scan play, was actually a very good player in 2019. And when he got to play in 2020, I thought he was very good. Obviously, he had the Zarya grab, and that's what everybody talks about. But I like Nene a lot, and Nene is a really good player. So I think Nene 100% is deserving of a spot here. This team, obviously, a very legendary team, so lots of players you can put in this list. If you don't follow the rules I put in, I'm sure a lot of people have different lists, but shout out to Nene, man. Great player. Next from 2020, I have Hawksall. Once again, 2020, they only added a few players. They added Bianca, they added Hotba, and then they, late in the season, added Hawksall. So, not a ton of options. My flex DPS choice, of course, would be Libero, because Libero is my boy, and I love Libero, and he is my favorite player to ever play for the NYXL. But I digress. Hawksall, very good player, and I think that Hawksall, even with the NYXL, he wasn't as good with the NYXL as he was when he was with the Vancouver Titans, but he was still an incredible, outstanding player who brought a lot of energy to the NYXL team, and I think that you have to give a lot of credit to Hawksall for coming back after the rough end that was his time with the Vancouver Titans, coming back into the league, going to the NYXL, and giving it his all, and performing pretty well. From 2021, I have Flora, very good player, of course, player that they're building their future around. I love Flora. I think Flora's a great player. I think he's a fantastic piece, and I think that he will be kind of the staple player for the NYXL for a long time, and definitely the highlight from that 2021 roster. The last 3, of course, it's going to be, it's Mono, it's Meko, and then it's Animo. Best main tank, best off tank, best main support this team has ever had. Ups and downs with these players, of course, throughout their time with the NYXL, but these are legends of the game. They're legends of the NYXL, so they're on this roster, rounding out this incredible, one of the best, I would argue, lineups so far. Paris Eternal are next. Interesting team with a really interesting history. Starting off with them, I have Soon. I really like Soon. He was with the Eternal. I like him to do with the Valiant too, but this is just based on his time with the Eternal. 2 great seasons with the Eternal in 2019 and 2020. One of the inaugural players, one of the big signings they wanted. Soon wanted to go play for Paris. Wanted to play for his hometown team. And I think you have to have Soon on here. I think he's one of the most important players to the Eternal's history. And there we go. That's Soon for you. Next is FD God. I think FD God was incredible in 2020. Was he the best player on the team? Maybe not, but I wanted to put him on here because I think he deserves a ton of credit for what he was able to do for this Eternal roster. And I think that he energized the team in a way that very few other players did. Obviously, Sparkle was the big one, but FD God, you have to give a lot of credit for what he was able to do. For 2021, I have Naga. I think he was the best player in the 2021 roster. A team that surprised a lot of people based on how they played. They were a lot better than people expected them to be. And so, credit where credit is due. Naga, to me, was the best player from 2021 on the Eternal. Sparkle is my final DPS player on this team. Like, obviously, Sparkle was amazing with the Eternal. Was instrumental in them winning the 2020 Summer Showdown for North America. His Genji play was really the reason they did that, so have to put Sparkle here. Main tank, I went with Ben Best because Ben Best was very good when he was with this team, and I don't think you can really talk about the history of the Paris Eternal and not have Ben Best on this list. For off tank, of course, I went with Hanbin because Hanbin was incredible, had an MVP caliber season with the Eternal in 2020. Didn't necessarily get the credit that I think he probably deserved, but we know now he is a legendary player. Finally, for flex support, I was pretty torn between Fielder and Khan, but I ultimately went with Khan. I think Fielder is an incredible player, and obviously the legend of Fielder was born in the 200 ping days of the Paris Eternal. But Khan just impressed me so much this past season for a team that I really had so little expectations about, and I just thought would be pretty average and mediocre. Khan was one of the best players on that team, and I think that you cannot talk about what we saw from the Paris Eternal this past season and not mention Khan. So Khan rounds out, for me, this Paris Eternal dream team. Next, the Philadelphia Fusion, another legendary team with a lot of really great players throughout their history. The first one, of course, though, is Carpe. Like, Carpe is the best player the Fusion have ever had. He is, like, the legend of the Philadelphia Fusion. They have built around him for 5 years now. And you will never see me doubt Carpe and his abilities as a player. And I mentioned there could be some exceptions for players that have to be from a season. This 2019 Fusion player is the first major exception. And the real reason is because the Fusion only added 2 players in 2019. They added Elk, who was a bench player, really didn't play all that much, and then they traded in the middle of the season to add Kib, who also barely played at all. So for me, I went with a player who we did see in 2018, but didn't play the majority of the season, because he was suspended for 30 games. So he really kind of came into the fold late in 2018 and most of 2019, of course, and that is Sato. I know he was on the team in 2018, but like I said, they didn't really give me many options, so this is one of the few exceptions I'm making. Sato, I think, is the best main tank we've seen on the Fusion, especially from 2020. He had definitely some slumps in 2019. 2018, he looked very, very good, when we did see him. But 2020 was such a bounce-back, resurgent, dominant year for the Philadelphia Fusion. You have to give a ton of credit to Sato for his incredible play with the team at that time. 2020 representative, of course, is Alarm, Rookie of the Year from 2020. Tragically, of course, lost him earlier this year. But Alarm was amazing. He was such a great player. Did so much of the Fusion team. You cannot talk about the incredible run in 2020 that the Fusion made and not talk about one of the best players we've ever seen. Someone take from us far too soon. So, Alarm, you will be missed. You will always be remembered. And you will be remembered as one of the greats. Not just what you brought in game, but also who you were out of game and the type of person that you were. So we miss you, Alarm, and sad to see you taken from us so soon. 2021, odd year for the Fusion, obviously. They had to bring in some emergency players in Rascal and Hotba and Toby to fill in for this roster. Hoppa, though, had also played in 2018, so he couldn't really be considered. It's really just between Rascal and Toby or Shockwave, if you want to consider it a little bit that he played. I went with Rascal, because I think when he played, he looked pretty good, and I think that he was kind of the best player from the 3 that they brought in. And as much as I really like Toby, I also think that he has not been the best main support from this team's history. And the Fusion have been such a Carpe-heavy show for so long that it's really difficult to kind of pick anybody else. But the third DPS I went with is, of course, EQO, because he was incredible for this team for so long, and he was such an important piece to this team. Obviously, 2020 Summer Showdown Finals, one of the greatest plays we've ever seen. His Echo play was very good. Genji play was very good. So lots of love to EQO, lots of credit for him and his success, the stuff that he was able to bring to the Fusion during his time with the team. Had to recognize him. For off-tank with Poco, once again, legend of this team, has been around for a very long time, was with this team from the beginning. Didn't get as much playtime in 2021, and by as much, I mean any, because of visa issues, but he was a star for them in 2018, a star for them in 2019. And though he did split time with Fury early in 2020 and did kind of get bench for him at the end, I think you have to recognize Poco as the best off-tank just over time that the Fusion did have. Finally, at main support, I am going with Funny Astro, because Funny Astro, very, very good player. Only played really a season and a half for the Fusion, but that season and a half was very dynamic and very electric. So Funny Astro, to me, you know, created one of the best backlines we've ever seen with him and Alarm. So he may no longer be with the team, but he, to me, was the standout main support for this Fusion roster. Next to the San Francisco Shock, two-time Overwatch League champions. There's no shortage of players for this one. 2018 went with Super. Been with the team for a really long time. Kind of the heart and soul of this Shock roster. I've been very critical of him at times, but you cannot deny that Super is among the best main tanks we've ever seen in the Overwatch League, and certainly has what it takes to be an elite level player, and is one of the best players we've ever seen, and is a Shock legend. So no way he would not be on this list. 2019, have to go with Violet. Joined the team in 2019, and was a really good player for them from day one. And just the past 3 seasons have been just Violet just dominating and being incredible. So Violet, of course, was going to make this list. From 2020, I went with Ants. He was a role star. He was an incredible DPS player for the San Francisco Shock in their second consecutive grand final season. Not a lot of people expected much from him, but Ants was one of the best pieces from that team. So credit to him for really surprising a lot of people. Kind of just this surprise announcement on like Christmas time that he was joining the team, and then he was one of the best. So huge shout out to Ants for his incredible 2020 season. Nero is my pick for 2021. The 2021 Shock were not the most consistent, but of the new pieces that they did get, with you know, Nero and FD God and Glister, I think Nero was the best of the 3. I thought he was the most consistent of the 3. I really liked watching Nero play in 2021. I think he got a bit of a bad rap from a lot of the community, but I do think he was incredible for this team, and I think you cannot deny that of the players that added in 2021, Nero was the top choice. Rounding out the DPS, I went with Striker, Grand Finals MVP in 2020, an incredibly talented player. Didn't get as much playtime in 2019, just because of the way the meta worked, but as soon as hero pools became a thing, or the 2-2-2 role lock became a thing, Striker was unleashed upon the world again, and dominated in 2019 when he played, dominated in 2020, and dominated when he played in 2021 before he retired. But, I mean, Striker to me is one of the best players we've ever seen in the Overwatch League, and his performances on the Shock were still an incredible part of that, and still a major part of that. So always big on Striker, always love seeing Striker play, so definitely deserving of this spot here. Off tank, of course, is going to be Choyobin. Main support, of course, is going to be Moth. You look at the San Francisco Shock. I mean, this is basically, I mean, six of these players were on their championship roster in 2020. 5 of these players on their championship roster in 2019 and 2020. So, you know, we're talking about elite level players here. So some of the best that we've ever seen at all of their roles. So definitely one of the all-star teams just ever. Not even just the Shock. This is definitely one of the best 7-man rosters you could ever put together. That's the type of team the San Francisco Shock were in Overwatch 1. Moving on to the Seoul Dynasty, who the San Francisco Shock beat in the 2020 Grand Finals. First player for them I have to go with is Toby. I'm going to be open to you guys. Me putting Toby on this list really caused me some issues later on that I had to, once again, break my own rules. But I don't think you can not put Toby on this list. I think most of you would agree that Toby is the best and most notable player the Seoul Dynasty had going from 2018 to 2020. They've only ever really had two main supports, Toby and Animo, and Toby to me is number one. He is the player who I think most people would connect with the Seoul Dynasty because he was with Lunatic High, and then he was with the Seoul Dynasty for 3 seasons. So 100% to me, Toby is Mr. Seoul Dynasty, has to be on this list. Moving to 2019, you have Fitz, who joined the team in 2019. While I don't think 2019 was necessarily when we realized how good Fitz is, 2020 and 2021, Fitz was unleashed, created one of the best DPS duos in the league with his good old buddy Prophet, who was my 2020 pick. But Fitz's hit scan play was amazing. His Cassidy play, his Widowmaker play, absolutely incredible. You pair that with someone like Prophet, who can play Tracer at a high level, who can play Widowmaker, not Widowmaker, why did I say Widowmaker? Who can play, Pharah, play all these really great, flexible kind of heroes. These two made such a dynamic duo that they were among the best in the league. But as I mentioned, by having Toby on this list, I technically couldn't add a 2021 player because Sabiolbi didn't play enough. He didn't play at all. And I put Toby in over Animo because Toby was, to me, the most obvious choice. So I had to bend the rules a little bit for this one, but for my 2021 player, I'm going with Creative. Yes, he was on this team in 2020. He played in the 2020 playoffs, but he was splitting a lot of time with Badoshin. But 2021 was when he really kind of was given the starting role for this team, and I thought he was a very solid player. So have to put Creative on this list. Ryu Jaehong also could be on this list, and I think a lot of people would prefer to see Ryu Jaehong on this list, but rules are rules. I got to follow them at least a little bit. So Creative is rounding out the 4 players representing the different seasons for the Dynasty. Third DPS player I have on here is Fleta. I mean, yeah, he didn't win MVP with the Seoul Dynasty, but he was still the best player the Dynasty had in 2018 and 2019. So you will not see me ever say bad things about Fleta. Fleta's incredible. He's one of the best players I've ever seen. He was still really good with the Dynasty and deserves this spot here. And for the tanks, I went with Gesture and Marvel. Off-tank was never really a strong suit for the Seoul Dynasty. I was really critical of this team when they were playing Marvel on off-tank, but he was the better off-tank they had on this team. Michelle never really was able to do what we saw Marvel do. Gesture was the best main tank I think this team's ever really had in terms of Overwatch League level performances, and I think you have to give a lot of credit to this duo for leading them to the Grand Finals in 2020. They might both be main tank players, but Marvel's skill on Sigma was, he was among the best Sigma players in the league, that you can't just ignore that, and I think that he was really the best player that they had to ever play off-tank. So there we go. There's your Seoul Dynasty roster. Couple of potential rule breaks here, but I think you guys understand why, and I think most people will. You guys will give me a pass, I think. I hope. I don't know. Next, we have the Shanghai Dragons, 2021 Overwatch League champions, 0-40 in 2018. Kind of difficult to pick players from 2018 for this one. I think a lot of people would say the most obvious option was Fearless, but I did not actually go with Fearless for 2018. I went with Dia. I think you have to have at least one player who really represents that 2018 Shanghai Dragons roster. Fearless joined halfway through the season, and then, of course, was dominant in 2020 for the Dragons. But Dia was kind of one of the few players from that 2018 roster, the original 2018 roster, that was a standout player who was actually very, very good. Just recently announced to be rejoining the league with the LA Valiant. But Dia, I have to shout him out. I have to give him a spot on this roster. Everything will make sense as I go on, trust me. But definitely Dia, to me, is one of the best we've ever seen in terms of Chinese talent, and I had to give him a shout out here. 2019, I went with Izayaki. Joined the team very late in 2019, so didn't really have an impact in 2019, but in 2020 and 2021, he became one of the best flex supports in the Overwatch League, and so definitely a lot of love to him, and definitely deserving of this position here. 2020, of course, Fleta, MVP in 2020. I mean, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, man. Or I'm not gonna not sugarcoat it. He was 2020 MVP. Of course, he was the best player. He had to be the 2020 pick, hands down. Even though they had a lot of great players in 2020, Fleta is my 2020 selection. And from 2021, they did not add a lot of players, but they added Fate. He had to be on this list. I know people probably want Fearless on this list. People are gonna say Fearless was so good for this team, and he was there from the beginning. He was there on that 40 roster. I get it. He was. and he was really important to them in 2020. But find me a player that joined a new team in 2021 that had the same level of impact that Fate did with the Shanghai Dragons. I mean, you guys have noticed this. Fate's been on 3 lists, all right? Fate's been on 3 teams, and he was, in my opinion, an all-star in all 3 of them. He has been that good of a player. He was that consistent. He was that high level of a performer. You cannot tell me that Fate was not an integral part in this team winning the Grand Finals 2021. So to me, he has to be on this list. He is the final of the 4 seasonal picks for this team. And then to round it out, of course, we have Lip, we have Void, we have Lee Jae-gon. 3 of the best players in the league. This is literally the championship roster right here. This is the team that just won the Grand Finals. Plus Dia. So, love this team. This is a great team. To me, this is probably the best team of any of the ones we've put together so far. People may criticize the Dia pick, but I'm telling you right now, guys, Dia was incredible when he played for this team. He didn't get enough play time, I think, later on, because this team moved to a Korean roster, but he was such a great Chinese player on a really bad roster in 2018, but he was the bright spot, and he was a standout player, so I have to recognize him for his time with this team in 2018. Next, the Toronto Defiant. We're almost done. Just a few more teams. For 2019, this was the first season for this team. I'm going with Logix. Most of his time, I think, would be recognized from his time in 2020. But he was very good in 2019 as well. And have to give credit to what he was able to do for this team. From 2020, I went with Kariv. This team was not very good in 2020. Not very memorable in 2020, but Kariv, in my opinion, was one of the few bright spots for this roster in 2020. So, wanted to put him here for that. 2021, I went with Hisu. He was the best piece on that 2021 roster. They're continuing to build around him for a reason. He was a standout player for 2021. I thought he was pretty good with the Philadelphia Fusion. I thought he was incredible at the Toronto Defiant. So, huge love to Hisu. Glad to see him still in the league. And he is, in my opinion, the best player the Toronto Defiant have ever had. Right out of the DPS lineup, I went with Ivy. Maybe a bit of an interesting pick. People may not fully agree with this one, but I do really like Ivy on this list. I think Ivy is such a great player and such an important piece to that 2019 season. They weren't amazing back then, but Ivy to me was the highlight of that roster. It was, him and Logix, kind of the only 2 players that really stood out to me. And I could have put someone like Nice in here. I could have put someone like Surefour or Agilities, but I just think Ivy was a bit more of a consistent piece. And I just wanted to shout him out because I like Ivy a lot, and I'd feel bad not putting Ivy on any of the lists. And to me, he is kind of a Toronto Defiant legend, so had to put him on here. Main tank went with Sato. Off tank went with Michelle. Sato, to me, is definitively the best main tank this team has ever had. They were good this season. They weren't incredible, but they were good. And I think Sato had a great season for them. To me, off tank has always been the Defiant's weakest point. Envy in 2018, not very good. I almost put Gods in this spot because I just really like Gods. It's a bit funny to put in here, but I also think that he was actually a pretty solid player. But I just didn't think I could because I didn't think that the team was consistent enough with him playing. Nevix was also good. But to me, Michelle brought this team to the best season we've ever seen them play this past season. So I felt like Sato and Michelle had to be the 2 tanks for this team because they really are the only 2 that have really, in my opinion, had a really notable impact on this team. So they have to round this tank line out. And then for main support, I went with Roki. I wasn't really impressed by any of the main sports this Defiant roster have had, but Roki was there for a while, and he was pretty popular. So the team liked him a lot. The organization liked him a lot. So I put him on here because I think, shout out to players who maybe get forgotten at times, but Roki to me is kind of the main sport I think of when I think of the Defiant. So there you go. Rounds out the spot. Vancouver Titans, second to last roster here. Starting off with 2019, when they were the team with the best record in the regular season. Give it to Haksal. He was the Rookie of the Year that season. His second appearance on this video, but you gotta give it to Haksal, man. He was super good. Not much more to say about that. His Brigitte play was really, really good, and then when he got to kind of open up his hero pool play, stuff like Doomfist, he was still really, really good. 2020, not a great season for the Titans, but they did have one bright spot, and that was, in my opinion, Shockwave. I really liked Shockwave when he was with the Titans. I think he was the single most impressive player, hard carry player of any team that season, maybe Decay with the Justice, but Shockwave to me very much up there as well. His Echo was one of the best in the league, and I think that he deserves a lot of credit for what he did with the Titans, and I'm happy to see him back with the team, hoping he does well in 2022, back where he started his Overwatch League career. 2021 was not a great season for the Titans, but I do think Fried Wiener was probably the best player on the team. Good old Nathan. But he to me was one of the few players that kind of performed really, really well. You can kind of see he had a very vocal personality. He's had a very strong impact for the team. So lots of love to Fried Wiener. It's tough when you don't have a very, very strong season, but to me he was the most standout piece. Third DPS player was a little bit tricky for me to pick. I think outside of Hoxel, they never really had a stellar performance other than Shockwave. Sorry. Outside of Hoxel and Shockwave, they never really had a stellar DPS performance. Stitch never really played at the highest level with the Titans. Sominsu mainly was a Zarya player. Wasn't really known as much for his DPS performances. And then Dalton and Teru and Linkser and Suna were fine, the Titans. None of them really stood out to me that much. But I did ultimately decide to go to Sominsu just because his Zarya performance was really, really important for the Titans. I think you have to talk about him when you talk about their really good season 2019. Sominsu was a really big part of that. His performance on Zarya was a huge part of that. So, to me, have to give a shout out to Sominsu. It's Sominsu. He's big on Twitter. For main tank, I went with Bumper. I was always a very vocal critic of Bumper. I never thought Bumper was all that great. But he was definitively the best main tank the Titans had. I was never really impressed by Shredlock. We didn't really get to see any of Fissure, so can't really put him on this list. Tizzy didn't play long enough. Chongsik, once again, team wasn't very good with Chongsik there. Not necessarily fully his fault. So, Bumper, go-to guy when you think of main tanks in Vancouver Titans. He was a big personality. He was a really important part of this team, so definitely have to give him the shout here. And for the support line, I went with Slime and Twilight, of course, 2019. Twilight was an MVP candidate. Slime was another really good main support when he was with this team. So, to me, this is a very clear, pretty easy one to figure out. Some legends of the game here. And this support line was one of the best in the league in 2019. So, definitely the highlight for this roster back then. Final team we have is the Washington Justice. From 2019, I went with Corey. Corey was a very good player in 2019 and 2020. I mean, I think he still, to this day, might be the most beloved player the Justice have ever had. I think he's still an incredibly talented player who I will always remember for his performances, especially on Hangzhou against the Vancouver Titans. I think Corey is just such an impressive player to have seen kind of come up in the scene and really kind of erupt in a way that no one really saw coming. And I think you cannot talk about the Justice and not talk about Corey. For 2020, I went with Decay. I know he only played for a little bit, but to me, he was the standout piece of that team. That team had such roster turmoil and shakeup. Decay joins this team, and immediately they were a lot better. He was, every time Decay has played for the Justice, they've just been a better team. So I'm obviously going to give it to Decay. And for 2021, I went with a Mag. Definitely up and down season for Mag. He was never the most consistent player, but when Mag was good, he was one of the best main tanks I've ever seen. Mag's best games, he would play, and I'm thinking Mag might be the best player, might be the best main tank in the league because he was that good when he played. His Winston was incredible. His Reinhardt's incredible. I'm so excited for this team going forward because Mag is such a cool player. Just his story, was on Runaway, kind of could have probably been in the league in 2020, but COVID kind of messed that up. Comes into the Justice in 2021 and just pounds. An incredible player. Still, in my opinion, one of the elite main tanks going forward, so huge shout out to him. For my third DPS pick, this one might be a little controversial. I went with Stratus. A lot of people are going to look at me and say, you are nuts. How could you not pick someone like Assassin or Stitch or even Jerry maybe? But I think Stratus brought a lot to this team for the 2 seasons or season and a half he was there, right? The team was not very good, right? But to me, Stratus and Corey were the 2 main pieces to that team. But Stratus not only was, in my opinion, there because of his actual performance as a player, but he also was he was such a strong personality. He brought a lot of life and energy to a fan base that was pretty much dead because the Justice were so bad. Stratus was a beacon. He was a really bright light that kind of made the Justice a really exciting and fun and interesting team. So I think definitely when you think about some of the best players on the Justice, Stratus is among the top. And I think that he deserves a lot of credit for what he was able to do to kind of revitalize the fan base of a team that was pretty weak, all things considered. But rounding out this roster, I went with the off-tank extraordinaire Fury, and then I went with their support line from this past season. To me, Fury is a no-brainer because he is just, in my opinion, one of the best flex tanks we've ever seen. He almost could have been on 3 teams on this list, but I edged Poco a little bit more just because of his longevity with the fusion. But I think Fury's an incredible player, and definitely has to be on this list. With Closer and Bebe, it's pretty close, especially for Bebe, between Bebe and Aim God, but I just think Bebe had a little bit more that he did throughout his time. And then for me, Closer, I mean, it really was Closer or Arc, and to me, Closer was just a more consistent and just a better piece when he was with the Justice. So that's it. That's this video. I know this video is very, very long, and if you watch this whole thing, thank you very much. I'm very happy with this video, and I've been kind of sitting on this idea for a while. Didn't really know the best way to go about it, but I just decided, you know what, I haven't uploaded in a while. Let's just go all in, go big, long video, where I give you my kind of all-star teams for every team in the Overwatch League. So thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, let me know in the comments on your own list. If you agree with my lists, if you disagree with my lists, if you want to give me all 20 of your lists in the comments, I would love to hear that from you. And if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing for more like it in the future. That is going to be all from me for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. Hope you're all having a great holiday season. And until next time, bye-bye.